Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar, 3 Practices to Minimize Drift Between Audits. It is brought to you by Armor. I'm Ashley from HIS Talk and I'll be moderating. Our speaker today is Kurt Hagerman, Chief Information Security Officer at Armor. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kurt.
Thanks very much, Ashley, and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join this webinar, and I hope you'll find it useful. Just a little bit about myself. I've been in the IT security space for over 25 years. Strong background in consulting and auditing across multiple industry verticals, including quite a good bit of experience in the healthcare industry. And I do speak and write on security for payments, healthcare, and cloud security. So I've been at Armor for 4.5 years, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk with you today. So the agenda, really I want to just set the stage a little bit and kind of reiterate some things that you might already know about the value of healthcare data. So in other words, why are they coming after your data? Discuss some of the objectives that you have in protecting and defending healthcare data, as well as some of the challenges. And we're going to go into some depth on some of the challenges, because I think it helps set the stage to wrap up with these 3 practices to stay aligned with compliance and security between audits. It's really more of a continuous compliance and security posture. So we'll get started. The reality of healthcare data breaches. When you look at healthcare data, it is gold to the threat actors. They've shifted their focus away from the credit card industry to healthcare, primarily because the fraud prevention activity, along with the wider adoption of EMV, has made credit card records less valuable. I mean, they used to be, you used to be able to get multiple dollars, $10, $15, $20 a record for credit cards, and now it's $1 or less. And their shelf life is very short. Once you steal a bunch of credit card numbers, you have a very, very short period of time to actually get anything out of them. Whereas with healthcare records, they are more valuable, and they have a longer shelf life. There isn't really a fraud prevention system for healthcare records. There's healthcare data everywhere. Your doctor's offices have it, your pharmacy has it, your hospitals have it. It's just everywhere. Your insurance company has it. And there's a lot of information in a healthcare record that makes it very valuable. There's a lot of personal information. There's sometimes financial information, maybe credit card numbers, but sometimes bank account information if you're paying them that way. And that information can be used for a variety of purposes, like identity theft, financial fraud, and even insurance fraud. A lot of people are stealing that information, getting insurance account numbers for the purposes of using that to get their own treatment without them paying for it. And they are used over a longer period of time. What we've seen is the lifespan of stolen healthcare records it really hasn't been fully understood, because we don't have any real good data on it. It just gets used over and over. They can parse it out and use a little bit of it at a time, because there's really no centralized repository for those records where you can look at that. This is a KPMG healthcare survey that was done in 2015, but it says 81% of healthcare companies have had a data breach in the past 2 years. So are you part of that? I mean, it's very likely that you've had some sort of data breach activity within your organization. And that's a fairly alarming statistic, that that high a percentage of healthcare organizations are being targeted. So it isn't just the big guys. It isn't just the Anthems and the other large healthcare organizations that have kind of been in the news recently. There's a lot on this slide. I'm really just going to kind of summarize it. You can look at some of the statistics on here, but I think a couple of them, just since October 1st, and this is probably 3 or 4 weeks old, there were 37 breaches just since October 1st, and over 270 through November 14th, exposing a bunch of records. It's on pace with the same number of hacks from last year. You know, and the top 10 breaches accounted for more than 111 million records. I mean, think about that for a minute. That's 1 out of every 3 residents of the United States. There's about 330 million people in the United States right now. So 1/3 of their records were exposed in just the top 10 breaches of 2015. So the 2016 breach stats aren't out yet, but it's been, I think actually that 270 breaches as of November 14th is through 2016. So again, it's happening. It's not going away. The threat actors are still being successful, which is why they're continuing to do it. So the healthcare threat landscape. So really, what are some of the primary threats that we have here? One is, you know, the devices, right? There's been an explosion in the Internet of Things, if you will, especially in the medical device field. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I've got a slide with a little more detail later on. But suffice it to say that hospitals and clinics and even the wearables, the things that we keep on our bodies now, are, you know, have grown exponentially. And so securing them and having them connected to our networks is just another big avenue for hackers to get in. Innovation, you know, healthcare, this is a quote from ThreatPost earlier this year, that healthcare is 10 to 15 years behind the retail sector when it comes to security. And, you know, my personal experience is, you know, bears that out. And I think it's not a knock. I think the reality is healthcare has always been about patient care. It's always been about, you know, providing the best possible care for patients. And I don't want to say the whole technology boom took healthcare by surprise, but it kind of did a little bit. And there's not been the focus on securing these records until recently, because there hasn't been a lot of breach activity until the last few years. You know, treatment systems, you know, systems for cardiology and infusion, MRIs, there's all kinds of these things that have documented vulnerabilities. You know, a couple of notable examples, you know, back when Dick Cheney was vice president and had to have a pacemaker inserted, they disabled and turned off all the wireless functionality that allowed for the wireless telemetry and for the doctor to be able to remotely adjust the pace, because they were afraid that hackers could get in and potentially cause him, you know, harm. They could turn off the pacemaker. There's also a surgery robot that was, there was a demo hack that was done where they got onto the network that this surgery robot was on. They sent a single packet that allowed them to remotely take over the machine, and they were able to change the parameters of what the doctor was putting in. So a 1 millimeter cut was changed to a 1 inch cut. So those are some real life examples of things that show that this can cause patient harm. And so these devices were never really built with security in mind. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So what are they after? You know, they're after obviously patient records, but they're also after your research and IP. I mean, most large healthcare organizations, some solely, work on, you know, you look at the pharmaceutical industry, the clinical research organizations, other, you know, research arms of a lot of hospital medical schools and things. They're working on cutting edge treatments that are all very valuable. So their IP is there. There's hacking for business advantage. They're trying to get into your financial system and see if they can do things. Also, you know, trying to deal with hospital reputation. I mean, that's probably where ransomware has come in, right? There's been a huge uptick in ransomware against hospitals and healthcare organizations where they're kind of embarrassing them and holding them hostage. So a lot of things that they're tracking. I think one of the points I'll talk about a little bit later is they're not after everything. They're after a small portion of the data, but they use whatever they can get at as a way to get to that, to the valuable data. So what are some of the healthcare IT challenges? So your objective as a healthcare organization is to protect EPHI data. To do that, you need to have secure infrastructure. You need to secure all these medical endpoints that we've talked about. You have to have some sort of seamless processes because a lot of these things are interdependent. They're not just standalone applications. You go into a hospital, there's everything from your check-in process to the monitoring of if you're having a procedure done, to the aftercare there, to the pharmacy, to all of the supplies, to all of the different testing that gets done. It all has to be orchestrated, so you have to have those kinds of processes. And you have to kind of make security easy for the end users, the doctors and nurses and other folks. I mean, the medical professionals, I was at a healthcare conference for a large provider about 2 months ago, and one of the themes that I kept hearing from a lot of the attendees was that physicians are spending upwards of 65% of their time dealing with administrative paperwork and compliance paperwork and things, and not treating their patients. So when they are in the clinical setting, having to remember 8 or 10 different passwords and having to log in and log out of machines is an annoyance to them. So you have to be able to make that easy. Well, what's kind of standing in the way of these objectives are things, most healthcare organizations, they don't understand their data landscape. They don't even know where the sensitive data actually is. A lot of weak authentication and role-based controls. A lot of the medical systems were not built with security in mind. So they don't have the kind of robustness built in to allow for strong authentication and good, tight role-based access control. Weak medical device security, we've talked a little bit about that. We'll chat a little bit more in depth about that in a slide or two. Stubborn end user adoption. People just don't want to change. A doctor may have privileges at multiple hospitals. He wants to take his iPad and his iPhone or other mobile device, and he wants to be able to go from hospital to hospital and access whatever records he needs from his device. He doesn't want to have to check out a new device or carry 4 or remember all of that stuff. The fact that HIPAA compliance is really not prescriptive. There's not a great roadmap. It doesn't, we're kind of driven in this country when it comes to, from a compliance perspective, give me the list of things I have to accomplish, right? Well, HIPAA doesn't really have that. And again, we'll go into more depth about that. There's third-party risk. How many of your organizations do everything that you do on your own? Probably none of them. You all have multiple third parties that you're dealing with. You're either sending them data, they're accessing data within your systems, they have access to maintain and otherwise have access to your systems, and how do you keep track of what they're doing, and how do you control and make sure that what their processes are secure as well. And then there's the budget and resources issue. I mean, nobody has all the money they need or all the people that they need. And when it comes to cybersecurity in the healthcare space, again, that's not your primary goal. So oftentimes IT and IT security are very short-staffed. They have very few people to try to manage this across the large enterprise because there simply isn't enough, there aren't enough resources, financial resources to support a larger group. So to go into a little bit more depth, when we talk about securing medical endpoints, there's all kinds of things in your environments that are now connected. Again, another personal anecdote, an aunt was very, very sick. I had to fly out because I was the closest in our family. She was, we were being told that she might not survive. She was in intensive care, and I walked into this intensive care place, and instead of the nurses having to go into each room to monitor, they had these pods set up and it monitored 4 rooms. And they had all the data, all the telemetry from all of the different devices coming into them so they could monitor and be more efficient at understanding what was going on with all their patients. And that was kind of interesting. But when you looked at it, there was all kinds of devices that were now connected to a network. Again, you go in, even supply cabinets, the little rolling supply carts that have gauze and bandages and scissors and all the different things that they use for drawing blood and other medical procedures, even those now are wirelessly connected because they have a lot of RFID in them so that they understand where supplies are and when they're getting low on certain things and they can replenish. So all of these things make it easier for healthcare organizations to provide their services, but most of those devices were never built with any sort of security in mind. It was an afterthought, if at all. So again, all of those things represent threats to your network. Again, does anybody really care about the inventory in a supply cart? No. But if that supply cart's connected to the network and there's a flaw in there that I can exploit easily and I can get access to your network, I'm all over that as a threat actor, because all I need is access and time. And I'll eventually find the information that I want. So, it's getting better. A lot of the medical device companies have listened and have heard the cries and are building more security in them. But again, it's not easy to just turn everything over in a single year, because back to the budget and resources issue. Poor understanding of your data landscape. I think this is a really endemic problem, really across a lot of industries. This is not unique to the healthcare industry. I've seen it in financial services, higher ed. I've seen it literally across the board. Most organizations aren't really sure. They don't have a definitive mapping of where all their sensitive data is. What happens is they may start with a few repositories, but then over time and in the process of trying to make things easier and people doing things, copies of data get put in different places to make it easier for people to work on. And then those copies of data are used by yet other people to facilitate their jobs. And so you get this sprawl, this data sprawl, and you also end up with integrity issues because they don't all go back to this main system of record. And so that can cause you to not know. So when you're looking at that, the result is I have to try to secure everything. Well, it's not very easy to secure everything. It's a lot easier if you can fundamentally understand where your most sensitive data is, and then do three things. Isolate that, through network segmentation is one way of doing that, but try to consolidate it to the point where if you have multiple people that need access for different things, make sure all that access is coming back to a main system of record. And then put strong access controls and authentication around those sensitive data repositories. Make sure that if individuals need access, that there's multi-factor authentication. There are other steps so that simple credential theft doesn't expose that information. If it's programmatic access, make sure that you're using properly secured service accounts or application accounts. And then the other thing to really consider, and it's really fundamentally a requirement under HIPAA, is to encrypt that data. They talk about encrypting PHI, but when I look at all the data that an organization stores, I will say, look, if it's sensitive data, treat it all the same. If it's your intellectual property, if it's your research data, encrypt that data, and encrypt it using role-based encryption solution that allows you to provide access based on role and based on credentials. Lots of new solutions on the market that make that much easier than it's been in the past to implement and give you much better control. And at least if somebody does get to that data and they don't have proper authorization, then the data that they extract is going to be useless because it would be encrypted. Now, that still doesn't prevent you from rogue insiders or somebody being able to trick somebody into doing something, but you got to work on the big threats first. So, once you understand your data landscape, try to map it, try to consolidate it, and then look at how do you isolate that, better secure access to it, and then encrypt it, and that can help. Making security for end users. It may seem a little counterintuitive, but simplifying end user access really doesn't have to make you less secure. There are a lot of new, and I think they're starting to call themselves adaptive authentication systems out there. There's a couple vendors. I'm not making a vendor pitch, but just as a way of giving you an example, Duo Security and SecureAuth both have very robust adaptive authentication mechanisms. And essentially what they do is they understand what is normal for a particular user. They look at where do you log in, when do you log in, what do you access normally, and what type of device do you access. And then you can create rules within there that can allow people to access to various levels of access. Like if you normally access things from inside your network on site, then if you're now accessing it from home or from some other location, they may make you go through additional verification hoops to understand who you are before they let you in, or they may block it altogether. You may be traveling out of the country with your phone or your tablet, and they may allow you to get into certain data but block access to other data. So, and those things can do a job, also do a job of central authentication. So now you have one place to do authentication for all of your different applications. So it simplifies the end user's needs so they don't have to remember 20 passwords. They have one way of doing that. Another thing that I've seen done, again, some sort of personal observation, is RFID type or near field communication login systems. My wife had a procedure done about a year ago, and that particular facility had enabled this on their workstations in the rooms. So when the doctor or nurse walked up to the machine, it logged them in. Because that near field communication, it read their badge, it knew who they were, and it logged them in. And when they stepped away, and they got like more than, I think, 2 or 3 feet away, it logged them out. So again, whatever you choose to do, there are solutions out there that can make security easier for end users and sort of combat that, that stubborn adoption. Third-party risk. We talked a little bit about the third parties. Everybody relies on them. Ponemon Institute study in 2016, over 50% of the hospitals surveyed claim they experienced a breach through a third-party vendor. This has been a very big focus of the Office of Civil Rights, which has the enforcement authority under the HIPAA regulation. They have embarked in 2016. I'm not sure how many they've gotten through because I haven't seen very many. I don't think they've published results yet, but they expanded on their audit program that started a few years ago, and their focus in 2016 was on auditing business associates because their evidence from reported breaches was showing that the vast majority of breaches were being caused by or were happening at third parties, were at the business associate level. So, you have to be able to manage your third party risk in order to protect your environment. Continuous compliance security. Most organizations, when it comes to an audit, if your organization has periodic audits, an annual audit, most organizations treat those as kind of like a college student studying for final exams. They really don't pay as much attention to it until about a week before the audit, and then they do a bunch of stuff, they get a bunch of documentation together, and then they hope for the best, right? They go in and they take the test and they cross their fingers. Similarly, when it comes to setting up security controls, a lot of organizations who are short-staffed, they buy into the marketing stories of all these security vendors that say this is the magic bullet, it's an easy button, whatever. Just set this application up or set this security control up, and you don't have to worry about it. So they kind of take a set it and forget it attitude towards setting up security. Well, that's just not the case. They need to be updated. They need to be monitored. They need to be, there's care and feeding. And also you need to have somebody who's paying attention to the alerts and the information that's being spit out by these in order to understand what's going on in your environment so that you can adapt your controls. So, this is a challenge for a lot of these organizations because they don't have the staff. They don't have the budget to get the right tools. And the threat actors kind of know that in this industry. And that's why they're hammering this industry, because even though you may have an audit, and even though it may be published, maybe the OCR has said, hey, we're going to audit these companies, they know that during the normal course of business, you probably are not keeping your eye on the ball. Another challenge is, and I mentioned this earlier, is compliance. HIPAA compliance is really not prescriptive. I've quoted here, this is my quote for what the basis of the HIPAA security rule is, which is to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of protected health information, and to protect that PHI from all reasonably anticipated threats. Great. How do I do that? It goes on to say that you start with a thorough risk assessment and understand what the risks and threats are to how you are handling that PHI. And then that you implement controls that are, and I'm air quoting here, reasonable and appropriate to your organization to mitigate those threats to an acceptable level. Well, that all sounds good, but when it comes down to, well, what do I actually have to do? There is no prescriptive nature of it. So you have to understand the risks that you face, and you have to prioritize, and again, do some of the big things first. I'll reiterate the three things that I talked about under the data landscape side. Understand where your data is, segment it, put strong authentication and access controls in place, and encrypt the sensitive data. If you can do those three things, that's going to take care of a big chunk of the risk that you face. Then you have to deal with some of the there are a few prescriptive things in there, but then you can expand. Once you get the big things done, then you can expand and say, okay, well, how can I address these specific risks that maybe aren't covered by by either of those three things? I would argue that if you put those three practices into effect, you're going to reduce the risk in your organization by quite a bit, and it may make implementation of other parts of your security program a little easier. So, so all of this has really been, what I've been trying to do is set up and help you understand where I see a lot of the challenges that the healthcare organizations face, so that we can boil it down and say, what three things, if there's, everybody wants to know what three things, what are my top three things to do? So here's my top three practices to help you stay aligned and secure and compliant between audits or on a continuous basis. And the first one is lead with security. Compliance should be and is a byproduct of a solid security program, not the source of it. Compliance regulations are kind of, I say, the equivalent of getting a C grade, right, in a class. It's the minimum you need to do to pass the class, but it certainly isn't going to get you the A or B. So lead with security. Assess your risk. Put a good, solid security controls program in place. Well, how do you do that? Well, there are plenty of frameworks out there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides, but use things like the PCI DSS, like the NIST cybersecurity framework. There are plenty of frameworks out there that give you a good idea of where to start and what kinds of controls. If you're in the healthcare industry, the High Trust Alliance was formed for that specific purpose. They took the intent and they read through and all of the HIPAA legislation, and they created a prescriptive framework of controls that you could pick and choose from, and they actually provide a lot of guidance in which ones apply based on how your organization is set up in handling PHI to help you understand what kinds of risks you face and how to mitigate them. Compliance, again, it's a point in time. It's somebody coming in and saying, yes, as of today, you're doing all the right things. And it really is just demonstrating how your security program meets somebody's arbitrary set of requirements. So again, lead with security, put a good, strong security program in place, and then compliance actually becomes easy, because all you have to do is just report on how you're meeting those requirements. Second, operationalized security and compliance. Again, we talked about how a lot of organizations look at this as a once a year or maybe twice a year kind of an exercise. Make security and compliance part of your regular business as usual operations. Understand that when you are going to implement a new system or you're looking at buying a new set of medical devices or tools, make sure that there's a security review in that to make sure that it's meeting all of the requirements that you need in order for it to allow you to remain in compliance with HIPAA. Risk assessment should be an ongoing process. It should be part of what everybody does. I'm changing a process. How does that impact me? I'm adding a new service. How does that impact me? I'm taking something away. I'm removing an application. How does that impact my organization? Does it impact my security posture? Could it impact my compliance? And then have a more regular review and audit of your internal controls and processes. You need to understand the threat landscape changes on a daily basis. So you need to have someone, and even if you hire it out and find a third party who can provide you with good threat intelligence or information on how the threat landscape is changing, then you can take that input and be proactive and adjust your security controls program to make sure you're mitigating that threat. It doesn't always mean you have to spend money on a new tool. It may just mean you have to enable different functionality, or you have to use it differently, or maybe you have to change some of your business processes to address the threat as opposed to always buying a new tool. You know, an example, I have a friend locally who's the CISO of a decent-sized hospital network, and he was talking to me once about how he had over 30 manufacturers of ultrasound machines across his facilities. I didn't even know there were 30 different manufacturers for ultrasound machines. And they had various levels of security built into them, from essentially none to some that were actually pretty good. So one of the things he's done as part of operationalizing security and compliance is he's built in, and then now has the support of the CIO to have a security review. And what they're doing is he's doing and reviewing the different kinds of equipment that they have, and coming up with an approved list of 2 or 3 vendors, so that when equipment comes up for replacement, they have to only buy from that 2 or 3 vendors. They can't buy from anybody else, because those vendors have shown and demonstrated that they have the security, and that he can integrate those devices into his network without compromising security and compliance. So that's just one example of how a CISO has gone through and been proactive to try to help operationalize this. So there's other ways, you know, to do that. But the more you get it ingrained in how your organization operates, the more successful you'll be. And then finally, is manage your third parties. It's not always easy. You need to have a program to periodically assess and validate that they're current with whatever your contract is, as well as with regulatory requirements. Make sure you document each party's responsibilities for security and privacy. Make them document it. Make them tell you, for the service that they're providing you, what they're responsible for and how they're addressing those responsibilities. Make sure that any contracts you have are flexible to address new risks and threats. If some new risk or threat comes up in a particular part of the industry that they're providing you a service for, make sure that you have the ability to enforce new controls and force them to enforce new requirements on them. And then please require at least one external audit attestation. There are so many organizations that don't have third-party audits, and we all try to rely on the sort of our questionnaires or self-assessment. And I can tell you from my experience in the audit world that when people self-assess, I have a 100% failure rate of them assessing themselves correctly. And that's not due to somebody trying to game the system or malfeasance. It's just we don't grade ourselves honestly. We all think, we make assumptions, and those assumptions follow through our analysis. So maybe they're high trust certified. Maybe they have a SOC 2. Even if they're not, even if it's not a healthcare related certification, something, even PCI validation, because maybe their business does PCI work for some set of their customers. Make sure there's at least one third party that has reviewed them and against some framework and given you some comfort. So I got a bonus slide. It's just ones and zeros. This is one of my favorite kind of sayings. Data is just ones and zeros. It's effectively a stream of ones and zeros that are either being transmitted between systems or stored, processed by a system, or stored on some sort of storage medium. The applications, whoops, I think I lost, there we go. The applications and systems themselves don't know what the data is. They don't know whether it's an account number, a credit card number, a medical diagnosis. They don't. It's just ones and zeros. So simplify how you're securing your data. Because it's just ones and zeros, there's only so many ways to secure data that's being stored, transmitted, or processed. So treat all the sensitive data the same. Don't try to put different controls on, because as in healthcare, most of you are also subject to PCI. PCI is very prescriptive. It says you will do these things. You will not do these things. Well, take a look at those and see if you can integrate those into your overall security program so that you're treating all the data the same. Then you're not, it's easier for you to manage the program that way. Learn where your data is. Go through that mapping exercise. Understand where it's stored, what is it, and who's accessing it. And then, again, learn to do those big things right. Once you understand where your data is, segment it, put strong authentication and access controls around it, and encrypt it. You'll understand that you and your organization, this is not an IT, this kind of compliance is not just an IT function. It cuts across the entire organization. Everybody who's accessing or anything to it, accessing that data, has to be on board. They have to all understand that it's a collective effort to secure the data. I've seen multiple examples in my consulting career and auditing career where someone in the department, in order to get their job done, did something without really, that was kind of outside of process. It made sense to them, and it, when you look at it operationally, it made sense. It made their jobs easier. But it opened up a whole new area of risk because all of a sudden data that was supposed to be in one system was now being stored in a spreadsheet on their desktop, or it was in an email. So, you have to have security awareness amongst your staff. You have to have buy-in that you're all in this together. And then follow. Use other compliance control, PCI NIST, ISO 27001 as guideposts. They are frameworks that have borne the test of time. There are lots of organizations that base their security programs on these frameworks. They're well thought out. They give you good insight into the kinds of things that you can do to protect your data. So I may have talked a little quickly. I do have that tendency as I'm pretty passionate about this stuff. So that's it for the presentation. I think we can go to the Q&A session. Ashley, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Kurt. No, it's perfect. That leaves plenty of time for Q&A. I currently have 2 questions in the queue. The first one is, how can I better defend my business against ransomware attacks?
I think, ransomware has typically been perpetrated through the introduction of malware. It's typically somebody sending, it's almost always the result of a phishing attack. So a threat actor sends in email to one or more people to try to get them to click on a link or open a file. So ransomware, security awareness is probably security awareness training is probably your #1 defense against that. Make sure your users understand not to open attachments from people they don't know about. There's a lot of good information from a training perspective. Second way to help prevent is we'd like to think that we can make our employees perfect, but they're not going to be. So make sure that you have frequent, accurate, and complete backups of all of your critical data. So if that's databases, make sure that you're doing some sort of dump on an hourly basis or something, and it's being stored in a different system so that if in the event that you do get subjected to ransomware and some system does get locked up, you have the ability to restore that system with minimal data loss. So those are probably the 2 biggest things you can do from a ransomware perspective.
Thank you. The next question is, do you have any best practices on evaluating a service provider?
Yeah, I think I talked about that pretty well. I think that you have to have a process internally. You have to be able to say, look, you have to first of all understand what they're doing for you and what kind of access to data are they going to have, either to your systems or what data are you shipping to them. And then based on that, you have to take a kind of a tiered approach, right? If they're just a vendor that's maintaining a piece of equipment and they have to come on site to do that, the security vetting of them as an organization is probably less important than a medical transcription company who you're sending doctors' transcription tapes to and asking them to enter them into a system and provide you with those transcriptions, or with a medical billing company who's reaching into your systems and pulling out all of the billing, all of the diagnosis and all the records so that they can prepare the bills. And those folks need to have a higher level of vetting. Get them to, ask them about their whether they have any third-party audits. Are they high trust certified? Do they have PCI validation? Something. And then engage with them. Far too often, people want to send a questionnaire, and they just want people to answer a questionnaire. And the problem with that approach is that people can say anything they want to say. And some people are very artful at writing, and they can make it sound really great, when in fact it may not be. So have a conversation. Have your security people, I mean, you've got to have at least one, get on the phone and talk through them with, once they understand what the thing is, have them ask questions and probe and see what kind of an explanation you're getting. People on a phone or in an in-person meeting are a lot less able to hide the truth from a good security person than just by answering a questionnaire. So I think you have to engage with your service providers. You have to make sure they clearly understand and you clearly understand what they're doing, what data they're touching, and then make sure that you're satisfied that they're doing the right thing and that they have some third party that's attesting to that on at least an annual basis.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Last question is that I have right now is a reminder, if we have any additional questions from the audience, you can use the question option within the GoToWebinar console. The last question is, how do you anticipate, if at all, any changes in frequency or environment of 2017 OSCAR audits with their recent announcement that they're going to perform more on-site audits?
So 2016, they focused on what they call desk audits. So these were mostly paperwork audits where they were requesting documentation of people's security programs. And that was an easy way for them to get through kind of a high number. I think they were targeting doing 800 or so of these desk audits in 2016. Again, I haven't seen the results. I don't know that they've been published yet. But I think they're now going to move to these on-site audits, and they're going to use the results, I think, of these desk audits to inform an on-site audit program. So they want to understand what are their trends, are there weaknesses that they see across a wide swath. If you go back to the first set of audits that was done, I think in 2010 by KPMG, they found some interesting things, like most organizations either didn't do risk assessments or had poorly documented them, or they were poorly done. That was one of the big findings. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to use these to target the areas that they want to focus on in on-site audits. And I think, in terms of preparation, you really need to make sure, first of all, that you've got the adequate documentation in place. If you don't have a good, well-documented risk assessment, an on-site audit is going to go very poorly, because you're not going to be able to to justify either the inclusion or exclusion of security controls. You have no way of justifying the security program you put in place. So first thing, do a good risk assessment. And if you need help, there's plenty of third parties out there, third-party security companies that can help you conduct a risk assessment and document it properly. And then after that, it's got to be, you really just have to make sure that you have the ability to demonstrate that the controls that you've chosen to put in place operate effectively. So that means getting your IT people, your security people, maybe some of the clinicians who are responsible for the imaging systems and other things, make sure they understand that they're going to have to demonstrate how they've implemented strong access control and other kinds of controls, and make sure that they're prepared to do that. So kind of go through ahead of time and look at those controls that you've put in place and ask people to produce evidence, whether it's screenshots or printout reports or other, of how they are meeting those controls. Show them the effectiveness. Because if you can do that and build kind of a book of evidence that shows that you've checked into and looked into and have evidence that shows that, yes, this security control is in place, and here's how it's being effective. When the auditor walks in, if you can show them your risk assessment and then show them this book of evidence, things are going to go a lot better for you, because the auditor's going to see this company, this organization's organized. They understand what their responsibilities are, and they've done it. They've prepared as well as they can. Now, Does that mean they're not going to find something? Sure, not. Nobody's perfect, right? And most audits uncover something, but the more well-prepared you can be in terms of having that evidence documented is going to make that process go a lot easier.
Great, thank you. That was our last question. So we're going to conclude our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Kurt, for an interesting and very informative presentation. As a reminder to the attendees, please watch your email for links to the recording of today's webinar, as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. And we look forward to seeing you at our next HIS Talk webinar, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.